It's Radio Free 501c, the podcast of Rogue Tulips Consulting. We're here with Season 7. So glad you're joining us. I'm your host, Cecilia Supp, CAEACNP, and I'm so glad you're here for this exciting year of so many great topics, so don't forget to subscribe. March is Ethics Awareness Month, and we're closing out March with our second episode about the importance of ethics. I'm joined by my guest, Richard Shermanski of the ASAE Ethics Committee, another colleague of mine. He's going to talk with us about association ethical complaint procedures. It's March 31st, 2025. Welcome to episode 279. Hey, everybody, it's Monday, March 31st. No, I'm not kidding. It really is the end of the first quarter already. So I hope you had a good start to the year so far. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Radio Free 501c. I'm your host, Cecilia Supp. I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting. And thanks so much for joining us. I'd like to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already followed or subscribed, please take a second and do that because you don't want to miss this fantastic year of conversations we're having. We've had so many first-time guests this year, and we have another one this week. Our topic is a really important one, and it is in honor of Ethics Awareness Month, which is every March. So we are doing 2 episodes featuring my colleagues from the ASAE Ethics Committee, and this is the second episode in that 2-part series. Our topic is Association Ethical Complaint Procedures, and our guest is Richard Shermanski from the committee. Before we dive into the topic, Richard, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. Would you like to say hello to the audience and tell us a little about yourself?
Absolutely. Cecilia, thank you so much for having me. As Cecilia mentioned, my name is Richard Shermanski, and I am a professional ethics and compliance attorney who has about 10 years experience working specifically with complaint and adjudication offices within associations. I'm also currently a member of the Maryland State Bar Association Board of Governors. I sit on their ethics committee. I am also a county commissioner for people with disabilities in the state of Maryland, Montgomery County. I'm also a member of the Baltimore Teen Court through the organization of My Law, which I also sit on the board of directors on.
Wow, that's incredible. How do you have time for all that?
It uh, an understanding wife and a child who loves to play on his tablet.
Oh, that's great. I'm sorry, kind of caught you off guard with that one, Richard, but people ask me that a lot too. Like, how do you do all this stuff? And it's like, it just happens. It just flows together. And as a resident of Montgomery County, Maryland, thank you for being part of so many great things here in our county.
Thank you.
So our topic, as I mentioned, is association ethical complaint procedures. And this is something that I think we know about and maybe think about, but we're probably in the association community not as familiar with what to do if somebody violates a code of conduct or violates a code of ethics, as we are familiar with the fact that we do have codes of conduct and codes of ethics. Like at ASAE, we have standards of conduct that we talk about, and that's a big job that the ethics committee at ASAE does, is promoting that information and providing other guidance and support when people need it. So when we're looking at these complaint procedures, which I'm sure are always very delicate because we're dealing either internally with members or possibly externally with another body like that you might work with, like the Maryland Bar Association. So could you give us an overview of what might be included in a complaint procedure process?
Of course. Well, as I've experienced it, a complaint procedure process would be an association's openness to receive and process a complaint against their membership. What would happen is an individual, whether it's a member of the public or also a member of the organization, sees that a fellow member appears to have violated, whether it's the law or appears to be violating the code of conduct that's been established by the association. It gives them the opportunity to notify the association. The association then, through its own internal mechanisms, will process that complaint. That could include gathering the information, doing their own internal investigation if they have that ability, or potentially allowing another body like a state licensing board or court to review the matter. But ultimately, what will happen is the association's adjudicating body will then review the complaint, and however that may be, that could include a multitude of different possibilities how they do it. And we can go over that further. But ultimately, what it means is that the association has this authority now to make a ruling based on the information that was provided to them and to determine if they violated their code of conduct or code of ethics.
So that's, and I know you said you would want to dive into this a little more detail later, but I'm already going there. So, one of my questions about complaint procedures is who should it start with? Should it start with staff or should it start with a member who's maybe on a committee?
It should start with staff. What would happen in that circumstance is that the person who's making them complaints should not immediately reach out to a board member or the authority that ultimately reviews the complaint. It needs to be processed and it needs to be reviewed by staff first to determine the viability of it. Because, for example, you don't want somebody who may perceive something to be a violation of the code and be harassing these volunteer members. What an association wants to do is make sure that there is a mechanism within the association that allows there to be a filtering process. In my role that I previously held, um, the process would be that a person makes a complaint and they provide us all the evidence that they have. And then it's ultimately reviewed by either myself or our senior director to determine that is there a legitimate viability to this complaint? For example, I've received complaints where someone just thinks somebody is, for lack of a better term, an asshole. And well, that's not necessarily a violation of the code of conduct or the code of ethics. But at the same time, imagine as if you as a volunteer staff member of a volunteer member of the board were receiving multiple complaints from individuals saying that, I don't like this person. I don't think they conduct themselves professionally, so on and so forth. When it comes to matters like this, there should be an internal mechanism within the association to at the very least be a filtration system before we get into the nit grit of the, board review process.
That's such a great point because there are times where somebody just doesn't like someone. And so they're not reporting an actual violation. They're just reporting the fact, I don't like this person. And maybe I want to push them out of a leadership role or maybe push them out of the organization altogether. And good point about asshole. It's not against the law to be an asshole, as my husband likes to remind me, even though sometimes we both agree it should be, but it's not. So getting past personality is very difficult, though, in membership organizations because we are the relationship industry and this is what drives us people coming together, connecting, or maybe not connecting, as the case may be. So, when we were getting ready for this episode, you mentioned the topic of the ripeness of a complaint, which I know it relates to how long can you wait or how long should you wait. So could you expand on that in a little more detail?
Absolutely. When it comes to ripeness, and that's a phrase us attorneys use when it comes to should we bring something forward to the court. Generally, in those circumstances, first things first, you want to make sure the event has occurred. So, for example, if you see a member saying like, "I'm going to do this" or "I plan to do this," and you think to yourself, "Well, that sounds like a violation of the code of ethics. I'm going to make a complaint with my association." If the event hasn't occurred, it automatically isn't right. We know that well, if the events haven't occurred, they might have just been blowing off steam, or they might have not been. Their head just might not have been in the right place at the time. But generally, in that circumstance, an association should not accept a complaint in a matter that hasn't even occurred yet. There might be a circumstance where it sounds like this individual may cause some legitimate harm to an association. So instead of taking it to the board, you may want to take it to HR or something to that effect. But generally, when it comes to, if the event hasn't occurred, then it's not going to then they haven't violated the code of ethics yet. Another circumstance would be too where, let's say an association doesn't have a large ethics staff or a large resource pool to review a complaint to great depths. For example, where the association that I'm from, the matter, we didn't have the ability to investigate a matter. We didn't have the ability to subpoena individuals or get records from them and require them to give them to us. We just didn't have that ability. However, state licensing boards and courts obviously do. In fact, most state boards that I worked with did have that ability. I can't say all, but I'm pretty sure all of them do. Um,
I hope
in
so.
those circumstances, what would happen is you would have a circumstance where an individual may have violated the code of ethics by their actions, but the board of ethics and the ethics staff, well, sorry, the ethics staff are aware that there's a pending state board decision or that there's a pending court case coming up. The association may want at that point to say the matter isn't right because we want there to be a full investigation on this matter, and the state board or the court is going to perform it. So we're going to defer the matter and wait for those decisions to be made before before we ultimately hear the case. Now, that's not to say you can't accept the complaint. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know, as a person making the complaint, I feel that this is a matter that I want to bring to your attention and I want you to be aware of it. That's perfectly fine. And there should be a mechanism in the association to say, we have received the complaint, we've noted it, and they may even open it for future review. They may give it a case number and say, we're going to review this once we get once we know the matter is resolved on the next level. But for associations that don't have those, have the ability to do so on their own, do their own investigations, they may want to defer it, wait for it to be right for them to make a full decision on it. Now, that's not to say some associations don't have that ability. There are some associations that have budgets, on staff attorneys who may do a full investigation. And if that's the case, if they have those resources, then ultimately they can accept the complaint and move forward on their own without having to wait for those decisions. But generally, a lot of associations will want to wait for that determination to be made on the other levels.
Well, that leads me in the direction of liability. So if an association is investigating a member for a violation of one of the standards of conduct or code of ethics, what sort of liability do they have to be aware of, especially if it might end up at a state bar association or medical board or some other state board?
Now you're asking what their liability would be if they don't review the matter,
Well,
or
actually, I'm thinking if they do they have liability if they do? And actually the flip side as well, liability if they don't do something. But like what liability might they be open to if they do launch an investigation? Because to me, it doesn't seem like this would be covered by your typical D&O insurance, but maybe it would. I don't know.
have the liability to abide by your practices and procedures. And I'll start with that one. The first point about abiding by your practices and procedures, and there's where a big part of your liability lies, that let's say your practices and procedures say that in the first round of the review process by the Board of Ethics, that there will be six members of the Board of Ethics. Let's say it's a 13-member board, six members will be reviewing it, and all six of them must be members certified by your association. Now, the liability there lies in, oh, we only had four and we didn't have a quorum, but we went forward with it anyway. There would be a violation of your practices and procedures, and thus you'd be liable for that. Again, also following by, as I mentioned earlier, your practice and your excuse me, your past precedent. So you could say like, okay, we have had in the course of the many decades that we've had a board of ethics, DUI cases, first time DUI cases, always receive a written warning as long as they were, one, self-reported, and two, nobody was harmed and nobody was, not the person ultimately was just pulled over. Nothing of any property or physical harm was done. We've always given for those situations a written warning. Or another good example of that too, from where I previously worked, it would also be a person missed their continuing education credit for, maybe they missed one, or they practiced without their state certification for a day. Those would be very minor in nature, and we'd always make sure that those sanctions, if given, those sanctions when given, were a written warning, but were very minor in nature. a violation there for your well, liability there would be you've decided that this board went decided to go rogue and say, I absolutely am against all of that. I'm going to make sure this person receives the highest punishment possible. You're going against your past precedent. You're going against what you've laid out, and it basically could potentially throw off future decisions, future cases, and that could be a liability there in and of itself. So things to consider there when you want to think about liability and how how a board of ethics proceeds.
Wow. So it's very similar to case law in some ways, where you have a precedent, you have to follow that precedent. You can look back at it. And if you're not following that consistently, I definitely see that as a big liability. So, on the flip side of that, what kind of liability would exist if you did nothing? If somebody came forward and said, oh, well, this guy violated one of our standards of conduct, and they filed whatever paperwork or form or whatever it is they have to fill out, and then just nothing happens, is there liability there if they just do nothing with it?
It depends on the level of severity where, again, that's where public trust can be lost as well. For example,
Mhm.
maybe you've received, in that year, you received 100 cases, 100 complaints about people who missed their CEs or, were on license for a day and such like that. Generally, some of those might fall through the cracks. It's just, it's human nature. These things happen. That might be a situation where, okay, no harm, no foul, but there is potential for liability there where you have, let's just say you certify your member, your organization, um, certified a known pedophile, and
Oh,
you are aware of this, and this complaint was made and it wasn't properly adjudicated, and while the person's license may be the person's state license may be gone, their membership and certification are still in good standing, in which they could then, the worst type of people may say to themselves like, well, I'm still certified, and they're not going to self-report themselves, they're not going to self-regulate themselves and keep themselves out of the profession. They may use that as an opportunity to have access to harming more people. There's where a liability would really there's where your as an organization's liability may really come in, because you're no longer doing your due diligence and protecting the public.
that wow, that's a big one to due diligence and protecting the public. And I think that leads us to 2 points that we decided we need to revisit, even though Joy and Lynette in our previous episode talked about it a lot. That's transparency and confidentiality. So, what if the known pedophile said, well, I'm on the registered sex offenders list, I've done what I'm supposed to do, so you have to keep it confidential?
When it comes to transparency, you want to make sure that the key thing that you're being transparent about is your process.
Okay.
The transparency thing is very important, so that if a person has a complaint made on them or a person wants to make a complaint, they know exactly what the process will be. For example, it may say on your website, you file your complaint here, within 45 days it's reviewed by staff. After those 45 days, you will receive notification, and so on and so forth. And we can go step by step on that. And here's how it's going to go. But when it comes to confidentiality, the difference in that is there are things that, while you may share with the public, there are things you cannot share. Let's go back to the example of a known pedophile in the association. If the board of ethics or the disciplinary board were to determine that this individual is going to have their membership and certification revoked for life, they would be transparent by sharing the person's name, what state they're in, what their violations were, and what their ultimate sanction was. But they're not going to release the details of victims. They're not going to release the note. They may not release They may or may not. I don't know how all associations work, but generally they don't release the information of the individual who made the complaint, while to the public. That may be made aware to the individual receiving the complaint. That's a different story, though. But generally, what's made available to the public is the need to know information, that this person, violated the code. Here's what state they live in, and here's the sanction that they received. If it's if it rises to that level if it rises to that level where that information needs to be dispensed to the public. But ultimately, the key thing with transparency is just making sure that you make sure that everyone is aware how the process works. And if they request updated information, for example, the person who makes the complaint wants to know the status, you can give the status, you can, but that's not public information, but you're being transparent with what the process is. So yeah, there's a difference between transparency and confidentiality.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you made that because I don't think we all think about that difference because transparent means you let people know what's going on, but you don't betray personal or private information, which is confidential. I like that. I hope that if there is a process at associations, they do keep everything confidential other than what needs to be out in the public. But I think when we're looking at that, I don't think a lot of associations, unless they're in, I'm just going to say, I'm going to throw this out there, unless they're like in a healthcare field or maybe a legal field of some kind, I don't know if there's a lot of like bar associations or the medical board or things like that that might be interested in what somebody did within an association. But what about transparency if you're not? Let's say you're like the association of hairstylists and they have to get a license to practice, but you're not necessarily complaining to a board like, oh, they shaved my head when I asked for a trim, sort of thing. So, I guess what's the public transparency there? Or maybe it's all internal.
Well, that might be internal. When you have smaller associations, as I've written in my previous article, for smaller associations, they might have a more intimate way of doing complaint review. They may have just a singular individual review the matter and ultimately make a decision. If an association has a complaint process, they need to publicize it. They need to show how they go about it. And again, they can't hide anything. They have to make sure that, if it is a singular person who makes the decision, they have to let people know that, or they have to know it's going to go before a board. In some matters, they may say, we, this association doesn't have a complaint department, but may offer resources where they can make a complaint. You made an example of people working as a hairdresser, and they have to be licensed in the state. There may be an association they're a part of that only has a staff of 3 or 4, and they may say, while we do not accept complaints, they may say that you submit your complaint and all of your evidence to the proper state licensing, because I've noticed that in my research when I would ultimately review a lot of state board um, websites, there is a licensing board for almost every profession, no matter how small you may think it is. There is often in many states a place where you can make a complaint, and at the very least, there's most states offer a Department of Consumer Affairs where you can file complaints as well. So maybe there is that profession where it's like, this might be just small enough where they don't accept complaints directly, but you can bring it to this specific location within the state protection agencies.
That's a good point. And there's always the terrible Yelp review too, if you can't find the licensing department to report to. That's really good tip. So you mentioned publicizing the complaint process or reporting process. I guess reporting process is probably better as opposed to a complaint. So do you think that the reporting process should be behind the member wall, as we like to call it, or do you think it should be right out there where like the whole public can see what your process is?
It needs to be open to everybody. Everybody needs to have the ability to make a complaint, because again, you're ultimately protect. You don't know who is going. Members of the public are going to utilize these resources, and they're going to need a place to go to make a complaint. It's not something you can necessarily. It's not something you should hide. It's it's something that needs to be made available. But that's where the crux of making sure that you have a staff to make sure that they can cycle through them, because in my time, I did receive a number of complaints that were clearly people trolling individuals, where they would get a group of people and send us 10, 20, 30 complaints on a singular individual, all because they had a professional disagreement with them. And it did not pass the smell test. It clearly wasn't a violation of the code of ethics. It simply was, you two had a professional misunderstanding amongst yourselves, and you've decided that you are going to take it out with them instead of working on it individually. You've decided that I'm going to, we are going to collectively make complaints on you and hopefully bother you enough to make you realize that this is, an issue for us. Now, we can't hide, associations can't hide that they have a complaint proceedings. However, they can have people properly trained to know when something isn't, a viable complaint or ripe for that matter. I dealt with that a lot. I've worked with a number of individuals. I would even request evidence. I would say to them, like, listen, we've received your complaint, but you've provided no evidence. Please provide, some type of information that can elaborate and at least make the case for why the code of ethics was was violated. Because the last thing we want to do, last thing any association wants to do is harass their own members by saying, hey, you just gotten your fifth complaint of the week, here's another complaint you now have to respond to. You want to make sure that all associations want to make sure that there is some mechanism to kind of be a stopgap for complaints just spewing in and ultimately trying to, wreck a person sorry, wreck a person's professional career.
And
And
well, and that's
I don't forgive me if you see me taking sips. I get dry mouth.
oh, that's no problem. It's a talk show. Be comfortable. So that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that like a group of people who didn't like someone or they had disagreement could just all start filing complaints. It's kind of similar almost to swatting someone where you call the police and say something bad's happening at their house, even when it's not. So what sort of action might an organization take if there is a group of people doing something like that? Would they just be handled in the process and the procedures, the review process? Because why are you're all acting unethically by casting false rumors about this person or false complaints about this person, and then does the association initiate that?
That's an interesting point too, because oftentimes it's from the public. In my experience, it's usually been from the public who makes those, and associations have no jurisdiction over members of the public. But you're right, that's a really good point. Say, for example, a group of, members of the association don't like another member of the association, and they may make a baseless complaint, but they're, again, I had a prior legal mentor explain this to me once, and that is the beauty of the beauty to the public or beauty to the outside members when it comes to making complaints with association is it's the cheapest avenue to seek your goal, because you're not filing with the court because attorney fees. You're not filing with the state because odds are when it comes to when it comes to going through the state process, that may require attorney fees as well. It's the cheapest way because you're going through the court process may require attorney fees. But when it comes to an association, you're just asking them to review this. There is no, and your time is, and as the person making the complaint, you're done. Your part is over. I filed my complaint. I've given you my evidence. Now you guys deal with it. It's the cheapest avenue to seek your goal. Now, in these circumstances, that it is imperative that again, you have a well-trained staff that can make sure that there's a stopgap here. However, the association as a whole, when they create their code of ethics or code of conduct, they may want to keep in there that you as a member of our association agree that you will not make frivolous, baseless complaints. So if that were to occur, that in and of itself could be a violation of the code of ethics. And, you can basically, the buck stops here with that when a person makes that complaint and you say this is clearly baseless. You are just committing a complaint. You are just committing a complaint for the sake of committing a complaint. That in itself could be a violation of the code of ethics. And if it's egregious enough where this person is making, let's just say, I don't like this person, they're an asshole, and I want them to just, you know, stop being an asshole. Okay, we're not going to accept this complaint. Please refrain from making these complaints in the past. And let's just say, and for the sake of the argument, that this person who made the complaint is a member of the association, who's making the person making the complaint. Now, let's say it goes to another extreme where um, this person, I'm making a complaint on this person because they are having an inappropriate relationship with my underage child, and
Oh,
I want them to stop right now. And there's absolutely no evidence of this. They just want to make this person's life, a living hell. And if it's egregious enough where it could legitimately affect, another person's career like that, then at that point, not only would the complaint not go forward, but the board may initiate, if it's within its practices and procedures, their own what's called a board initiated complaint against that person because they have clearly violated the code, or they can notify the individual, or this ethics staff could notify the person who has the complaint on them, saying, "Hey, there is this thing going on, and you are now within your right to make a complaint on them," and they could file their own complaint. It's really up to how the board has it in their practices and procedures and their bylaws.
well, so have you ever seen any processes that include some sort of arbitration aspect? Because these examples we've been using are, members complaining against other members that they don't like for some reason. So have you seen that, like arbitration within a reporting process?
Personally haven't, although I haven't seen it personally, but I am aware that there are some of those options in either other associations, even for that matter, in state boards. State boards in my experience with state boards, they often will have how can we alleviate this before we get to an administrative law judge, before we get to a board hearing? They may do that. In the association I worked for, that wasn't an option. However, there were opportunities, again, when you have these very minor offenses, or there might be a situation where an individual wants something back. It's like paperwork and things like that. What will happen is, while the association itself should not get itself involved with that, they what would happen is the person makes the complaint saying, like, oh, they took patient documentation, they took a laptop, or they took business filings that weren't theirs. And then well, that's clearly an issue for our code of ethics. So we send the complaint materials to that individual so that they can respond. They may say, "Oh, I apologize. I didn't realize that. I sent them all back to the individual, to the person who made the complaint." And then the person who got that may say, "You know what? I did receive everything. I'm dropping the case." But from my perspective, when it comes to me working, from my perspective within associations, generally that may open you up to liability, where you bring the parties in to try and have arbitration, and then it becomes well, by what authority, or whether it's by what authority, by what way is this at all binding? And then the board, they may ultimately, you if you do have that process, you want to make sure you run it by outside counsel first, or or your in-house counsel.
Well, or maybe you hire a professional arbitrator to come in and do it and not just staff.
But that in of itself opens up its own set of liabilities, because, as an association, you're hiring the arbitrator. What if one party doesn't like them, or what if they feel like it's very one-sided? You want to avoid that, because, again, you just want to go by your proper internal mechanisms, instead of trying to, again, that goes much back to why associations, mid-level, low tier, mid-level or lower associations or organizations may not do their own internal investigation, may not do their own independent investigations, because, for example, you would have a ethics staff calling in calling in people of the complaint and doing interviews with them, and you don't know how that's going to go. That may be, it could very well be he said, like, I came in here and I saw that Mr. Shermanski was very abrasive and didn't take my opinion into account. So everything I just said in this is now, it can be challenged, it can be, nullified. I want to take this to court now. I don't want to go through the proceedings of this board hearing, because you guys did for lack of a better term, a piss poor investigation.
So this brings me to a question I want to make sure we address in this episode, which is, let's say you're an association and you have a process in place, review process, or maybe you need to put one in place. So, what do you think are the things that associations need to consider and make sure they have in these sorts of review processes when people bring complaints forward?
One of the biggest things I would recommend an association has is a complaint filing system and a well thought out one. When I first, some associations that I've worked for did everything on paper, and it was very confusing. But the last association I worked for, everything was within an electronic system that you input the names, you input all the data, you input case numbers, immediately pops up when due dates are, when hearings are, when all of these. You want to make sure that there is a very intricate system so that you do not miss deadlines, you don't miss when things are, when things are moving forward, anything like that. That's to me one of the biggest things you need to have. Another thing you need to most definitely have again is a well-trained staff who make sure that all information is adequately reviewed and input and can be the stopgap. And then finally, not finally, and then next, making sure that your practices and procedures on how the complaint process works are public and make sense, and they're not, filled with legalese and oh gosh, I got to hire an attorney just to figure out how to make a complaint. And then finally, I think one of the biggest things is you want to make sure you have a well trained uh, review board, the board of ethics or the board, sorry, the disciplinary board, whatever you want to call it, and make sure that they understand what their responsibilities are, how they are not staff of the association. They are there to review the materials in front of them. They are there to make those determinations based on that information. Because the last thing you want in that circumstance is a board member who says, I just Googled this person. I see they're in jail right now. And that might have just happened the night before. Let's say, for example, an individual, we have a complaint where a person committed a DUI. That was a pretty egregious one. Let's say they got into a fender bender and they, harmed somebody in the process. And, courts made a decision and the board is reviewing the matter just based on that. And then as the board's about to review, they pull up their laptop, they Google the person's names like, oh, and by the way, they just robbed a liquor store yesterday.
Oh,
That's you want to make sure the board does not go rogue and and do that type of stuff because that's up for the staff to do. And then in that circumstance, then you may say, the person running the meeting may say, we're going to table this and review it but we can't take that type of information we can't take that information right at this point and make an adequate decision based on the information that we have. I've had circumstances where we've had DUI cases that ultimately the member self-reported us. And I just got pulled over for DUI. I want to self-report, and I would explain to them the code of ethics clearly states that you will self-report uh, final decisions. That you will self-report court decisions, state board decisions, so on and so forth. Being arrested and being charged are not the same as receiving a decision. For the old adage amongst attorneys is trials exist to be won. And let's just say let's say the person got a DUI and challenged it in court and won. They are no longer required to self-report.
that's
So in those circumstances, you want to make sure that, again, just based on that arrest, if I was to, as a member of the staff going through it and I saw that, headline is, you know, let's just say I worked for an association that certifies surgeons. Surgeon in North Carolina gets pulled over for a DUI, and we may just want to we may want to create a board initiated complaint on this matter, but then the person ultimately wins the case because maybe a technicality or maybe the cop took the blood test wrong and therefore everything's null and void. In those circumstances you have to know when that information, much like a board, like when we give it to the board, it's relevant to the case at hand.
That is such a great example. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, yes, of course, arrested and charged are two different things, and charged and found guilty or liable is another thing. So just getting arrested doesn't mean that something is going to follow that, because sometimes you get like, a wow, that's such a good and yet somewhat extreme case of someone robbing stores and getting DUIs. But maybe that's what led them to rob the store because they were drinking. Who knows? But we don't know what our members are going to do, is really the point, or why they do it. And again, why we need to have all these processes in place. And this episode has been chock full of information, and I'm sure we could talk for another hour, but I think we need to wrap up and just have you back to talk about all the other stuff that goes into these sorts of things, because you write a lot and speak a lot about the topic of ethics. So I know you have a lot to say. But before we wrap up the episode, as you know, Richard, I like to ask my guests, what is the one thought you would like the audience to take away today? And how could they get in touch with you if they had questions about maybe some of your articles or speaking engagements, or just want to ask you some more questions?
I think the biggest takeaway I would want our viewers to know is specifically that board of ethics members consist of like-minded individuals of the people who are having the complaints on them. I cannot tell you how many phone calls I receive from members who are on the verge of tears or already crying because
Mm.
of a complaint that was made on them, or they got arrested, what have you, and or maybe they just missed their deadline to get all their credits in, and now their state's doing something, and they are absolutely petrified that they are going to get punished by our board. And I explained to them, the board is not a group of frigid, statued attorneys or evil academia. They are people from all walks of life in this profession, and they have seen it all. They've done it all. They're human too. And the thing they want to know most in these matters is your side of the story. And they are not going to just make a snap decision based on the complaint materials. They want to know your side of the story, and they will take that under consideration. These members are human, and they understand. If you have a legitimate excuse, for example, we've had a number of them who I missed the deadline because my mother died. I missed the deadline because COVID. I missed this, I missed that, because the board is not there to just, oh, you have a complaint on you, strip them of their membership and all that. They want to know. So I always tell people, if you have a complaint on you, be open, be honest, and explain your side of the story, because the board will appreciate that far more than just trying to create a legal brief. Now, in some matters, yes, get an attorney. Yeah, if it's a serious enough offense, get an
Well,
attorney, get yourself someone to help defend you. But again, the boards want to hear from you. They don't want to hear the attorney may put it into the words to help better explain it, but don't be afraid to be open and honest. And
oh,
that would
that's
be
great.
my 2 cents for, mhm. That
And
would be
no,
my 2 cents to the members.
that's great. Thank you. And how can people get in touch?
They can get in touch with me. I'm easy to find. I'm on LinkedIn. You can just Google my name, LinkedIn, just go onto LinkedIn. You can see my name here, Richard Shermanski. Richard Shermanski Jr., I apologize. My father's also on there. So Richard Shermanski Jr., if you have any ethical procedural questions or anything like that, I'm always happy to discuss it.
Oh, that's great. And thank you again, Richard, for joining me this week.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Well, we have to go rogue for now, but we'll be back next time with another exciting episode. Again, quick reminder, if you haven't followed us or subscribed to us on your favorite podcast service, please take a moment and do that, because we have a whole year ahead of these kind of great in-depth conversations. And again, we want to remind you, both Richard and I, as members of the ASAE Ethics Committee, that March is Ethics Awareness Month. But please be aware of ethics all year long. You can get a copy of the ASAE Standards of Conduct at the ASAE website, which is asaecenter.org. And if you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting, you can go to our website, roguetulips.com. You can find this episode of our podcast featuring Richard and all of our past podcast episodes there. You can also learn more about how we can help your organization bloom outside the box by visiting our services page. And if you'd like to know what's on my mind this week, check out our blog, Going Rogue. So that's it for this week. Thanks again for joining us. And on behalf of Richard and myself, we'll see you next time. That's it for this week. I hope you really loved this episode as much as I did. Thanks for listening. Learn more about how our experience and knowledge at Rogue Tulips can give your organization the strategic edge to reach its goals. Check out our website at roguetulips.com. We'd love to talk with you and see how we can work together. Thanks.